and I work in the Reader Engagement Department at Mid-Continent Public Library in the Kansas City, Missouri area. We may have some of you may be joining from outside of Kansas City, so welcome. Our speaker is from Portland, Oregon, so we're all over the map tonight. But before I turn it over to Dr. Thurfelder, I want to give us a couple of housekeeping reminders. First of all, I want to commend you. You all did a great job of muting your mics as you came in or leaving them muted. We're going to go ahead and try to do that throughout the program so that we don't have any auditory feedback and we can all hear our presenter tonight. So go ahead and keep your microphones muted for me. The other thing is the use of the chat box. You can find a chat box on the Zoom programs, and I'm going to ask that you put your questions that you have about tonight's program on in that chat box, and that way we can have a few minutes at the end, and Dr. Thurfelder is going to answer as many questions as he can before we end tonight. So go ahead, and if you think of something throughout the program, even if you think it might be answered later, go ahead and throw that question in the chat. Also in the chat box, I'm going to add a link to our digital program evaluation. We read every single one, so we covet your feedback. Let us know what you think of tonight's program, how it went, and what we can do better if we missed the mark on something somehow. Also, I want to remind you that I'm going to send an email out to everyone who registered for this program tomorrow, and it is going to have the link to the YouTube video. Tonight's program is being recorded, so be aware of that. And it'll have the link to the YouTube video in case you want to watch it again, or send it to someone else you think might enjoy it that wasn't able to join us tonight. And it'll also have a list of upcoming programs, upcoming virtual programs. One of them at least has a couple of in-person options, and one has a hybrid, a dual. So one element will be a Zoom offering on one of them. We have, just as a quick preview, we have Vaqueros, the origin of the American cowboy. We have Latinx in Hollywood, gluten-free eating, bats, essential to our ecosystem, and horror movies, so bad they're frightening. So if you want to listen to some lectures on bats or really bad horror movies, well, I'm going to have some programs for you, so I'll send you the link to register for those. So thank you all so much, and I am going to introduce our speaker and turn it over to him. Dr. Bill Thurfelder is a retired professor of arts and humanities and docent emeritus from the American Museum of Natural History in New York. Born and raised in New York City, he currently lives in Portland, Oregon, like I said before, where he's a writer and a lecturer. He speaks on a broad range of topics, from literary figures like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and to the sciences, with special interest in human origins, space travel, the great composers, artists, and writers. So without any more from me, I'm turning over to our presenter. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And again, I'm Dr. Bill Thurfelder. I'm going to be your host tonight, and it is a pleasure to speak to you wherever you are listening from. Now, as you can see, our program is called Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, More Than Sherlock. And I would, again, like to thank the Mid-Continent Library for making this presentation possible. Now, since we cannot cover everything about this evening's topic in one 75-minute presentation, I'd like to invite you to take a deeper dive on my website, which is makingwings.net. And in this case, you're going to take deeper dive number 4. So what does that all mean? So my website is makingwings.net, and that's one word, Making Wings. And if we click on that, okay, you should be able to see. I'm going to just make sure that we are sharing. That is the home page of my website, Making Wings. And what I'm inviting you to do is to go to the upper right corner and click on that menu, and you're going to see a drop down. You may visit any of those that you want, but for this evening's presentation, please go to Deeper Dives, click on that little downward arrow, And what you're going to see there are topics that I have spoken about recently or will be speaking about in the future. Lots of stuff there. But tonight is number 4, Conan Doyle. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, more than Sherlock. And what you're going to find there is a quick overview of his life, some recommended media. We will be talking about some of these books during the presentation. And if you don't have a paper or pencil handy, you can always go to the website to copy down a title or an author. I also have print resources and video resources that I think you might find very, very interesting, as well as some bibliographies of Doyle's work. Now, if you do decide to use this, so for example, let's say you wanted to go to the Wikipedia biography of Doyle. So all you do is click on that, and you would be brought to that page. When you're done, just click it off, and you're back on my website. So I've tried to make it one-stop shopping for you. So you can go down the rabbit hole here and have some fun. So please take advantage of that. Okay, so I would like to say that everything that you're going to hear in the program this evening uses the web resources and the books that you just saw on my website. But for this presentation, I especially used the following sources to build its structure and its script. Wikipedia, the Biography Channel, Britannica, and the Arthur Conan Doyle Encyclopedia, which is a wonderful source. So as always, one of the things that you'll find on the website, I just showed you, is recommended reading and viewing. And I'd like to share 3 that I find good introductions. The first is Michael Sims' book called Arthur and Sherlock, which really gives you a nice feel for what inspired Doyle to create one of the most recognizable characters in all world literature. John Carr's biography of Doyle is solid. It's very balanced. And if you want some viewing pleasure, the Biography Channel produced a 46-minute overview of the character Sherlock Holmes that's really engaging. And it is available on DVD and on YouTube. And I believe I provided the link on my website if you want to watch it. And what's interesting, of course, about it is that this isn't a biography of Doyle. This is a biography of the character Sherlock Holmes. It's lots of fun. Well, that brings us to Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's life. Now, I've given you links on my website to very detailed biographies of Doyle. So for our purposes this evening, I'm just going to give you some biographical highlights. But an apt subtitle for this evening's program would be I Was More Than Sherlock Holmes. Though it seems like 95% of everything that's been written about Doyle focuses on Holmes, he actually created many other characters and books of equal quality. Indeed, by the time his life was winding down in the 1920s, he was saddened that his other work wasn't being given as much serious attention as his stories and novels about the great detective. But let's face it, Sir Arthur Ignatius Conan Doyle, who was born in Edinburgh, Scotland in 1859 into a prominent family with Irish roots, is best remembered today as the creator of Sherlock Holmes, probably one of the most enduring characters in all of English fiction. Indeed, Holmes has found his way into movies, television, radio, books, and short fiction thousands of times. In fact, the website for the Guinness Book of World Records posts this: Sherlock Holmes, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's fictional detective, has the world record for the most portrayed literary human character in film and TV. Well, let's go in a little deeper into Conan Doyle. Uh, Doyle was the second of 10 children of Charles Altamont Doyle and Mary Foley Doyle. Now, as I mentioned, the family was once quite prominent, but the eventual alcoholism and mental illness of his father, who at one time had been a successful illustrator and artist, caused the family to fall on harder times. Arthur began 7 years of Jesuit training in Lancaster, England in 1868 to help with the family income, especially when the father was in asylums. That sadly happened. Arthur's mother took in boarders. Now, through the influence of one of those lodgers, Dr. Brian Charles Waller, Arthur prepared for entry into the University of Edinburgh's medical school. And that's what you see as the background on your screen. He received his Bachelor of Medicine and then his Bachelor of Surgery qualifications from Edinburgh in 1881 and an MD in 1885 upon completing his thesis. Now, while he was a medical student, Conan Doyle was deeply impressed by the skill of one of his professors, Dr. Joseph Bell. Bell was known for observing the most minute detail regarding a patient's condition. This master of diagnostic deduction became the principal model for Conan Doyle's literary creation, Sherlock Holmes, who first appeared in A Study in Scarlet, a novel-length story published in 1887, just 2 years after he got his MD. And it appeared in a popular magazine of the time, Beeton's Christmas Annual. Now, there's a picture of Bell in the upper left of your screen, one of several photos that influenced the portrayal of Holmes by artists of the period and after. And in fact, if you look at this photo of him and then you look at an artist's representation, you can see that artists were very much inspired by Bell's image. And indeed, rightfully so, since Bell was one of the major influences on Doyle. Now, other aspects of Conan Doyle's medical education and experiences appear in his semi-autobiographical novels. You could see them there on the the left of your screen. The Firm of Girdlestone from 1890, The Stark Munro Letters from 1895, and in a collection of medical short stories called Round the Red Lamp from 1894. These, by the way, are excellent examples of what Doyle produced besides Sherlock Holmes stories and novels. They also show that Doyle, who focused much, even most of his time on writing, always considered himself a physician. And though he never had anything near what one would call a booming medical practice, he never fully abandoned his medical vocation, either in real life or, as the examples on your screen are, in fiction too. Now, Conan Doyle's creation of the logical, cold, calculating Holmes, the quote unquote world's first only consulting detective, well, that really contrasted sharply with the paranormal beliefs Conan Doyle addressed in a short novel of this same period called The Mystery of Clomber from 1889. And therein lies one of the great conflicts of Doyle's life. Conan Doyle's early interest in both scientifically supportable evidence that he certainly championed as a science-based physician, and certain paranormal phenomena such as fairies and ghosts exemplified the complex, diametrically opposing beliefs he struggled with throughout his life. Now, we're going to talk more about this as we move along. But it's fair to say that one could make a good argument for two Conan Doyles. The scientist who creates Sherlock Holmes on the one hand, and the spiritualist on the other, who believes in the astral bells, psychic powers, and haunting wraithful spirits, who are at the core of this early novel, The Mystery of Klumber. Now, driven by public clamor, Conan Doyle continued writing Sherlock Holmes adventures on and off through 1926. His 56 Holmes short stories were primarily published first in magazines and later collected into several volumes. All but two of those stories, The Adventure of the Lion's Mane and The Adventure of the Blanched Soldier, are related through the eyes of his friend and assistant and his biographer, Dr. John Watson. So, of those 56 stories, 54 are narrated by John Watson. Of course, Doyle also wrote 4 Sherlock Holmes novels, one of which, The Hound of the Baskervilles, is really considered by many to be his Sherlockian masterpiece. But Conan Doyle also claimed that the success of Holmes overshadowed the merit he believed his other fiction deserved, most notably his tale of 14th century chivalry called The White Company. You see that there in the lower right. And the 1912 novel, The Lost World, and its skeptical scientist hero, Professor George Edward Challenger. You may wonder why I have a dinosaur on the screen. Well, here it goes. Unlike the self-controlled analytical Sherlock Holmes, Professor Challenger is an aggressive, hot-tempered, dominating figure. Now, however, just as Sherlock Holmes is based on a real person, that Professor Bell, so Professor Challenger is based on 2 people. Not just one, but 2. One was an explorer named Percy Fawcett, who was Conan Doyle's friend. See him on the left. I just put a little red arrow to that. And the other, a professor of physiology named William Rutherford, whom you see on your right, who had lectured at the University of Edinburgh while Conan Doyle studied medicine there. Well, when Doyle's passions ran high, he also turned to nonfiction. Doyle went to South Africa in 1900 to serve as a medic for the British troops during the Second Anglo-Boer War. In that year, he wrote a book called The Great Boer War, which he compiled from information he obtained from personal interaction with both British and Boer soldiers. In 1902, he also wrote a pamphlet on the war called The War in South Africa, Its Causes and Conduct, which responded to all the charges leveled against the British for their conduct during the war. Doyle defended the British position in that pamphlet, and because of that work, and because it became so popular a work, he was knighted in October of 1902. So that's where you get the Sir Arthur Conan Doyle from. He was knighted because of his support for the Brits in the Boer War. He was also deeply disturbed and outraged by the Belgian atrocities in the Congo during King Leopold II's reign. He wrote The Crime of the Congo in 1909 as an expose of the brutality committed against the native peoples. And from 1916 to 1920, he produced a meticulous 6-volume examination of the British campaign in France and Flanders during World War One. So a lot of his nonfiction was about medicine and it was about war. Now, by the way, to anticipate a possible question, Doyle actually never enlisted in the military. By 1900 and after, frankly, he was too old and he was a bit overweight. But he was always at the ready to serve as a doctor in any capacity that he could. And that accounts for his going down to South Africa to serve as a medic, uh, but as a civilian medic. Now, as far as his love life was concerned, Doyle basically had two families. In 1885, he married Louisa Hawkins, with whom he had two children, Mary and Kingsley. Mary, who lived to the ripe age of 87 years, became a journalist as well as the manager of her father's psychic bookshop during the 1920s. And we're going to talk more about that in a little bit. The son, Kingsley, who studied to be a doctor like his dad, joined the army in 1914 and served as a medical officer. But sadly, he died at St. Thomas's Hospital in London from pneumonia during the great influenza pandemic of 1918. He was buried next to his mother, Louisa, and we're going to talk more about this in a few minutes. And buried next to mom, yes. After a prolonged bout of tuberculosis, Louisa died in 1906. Now, a year after Louisa's death in 1906, Doyle married his friend, Jean Leckie. Now, he had met Jean for the first time in 1897. She was 23 and he was 38. But he decided to keep the relationship platonic, especially during Louisa's lifetime, because he wanted to be a man of honor. So it was a platonic friendship. However, during that period between 1897 and Louisa's death in 1906, and then their eventual marriage in 1907, Jean and Arthur met many times for walks, for parties, for birthdays, and visits to the theater. Now, Louisa knew of the special, Louisa, the first wife, knew of the special friendship that he had with Jean, but was, according to her daughter Mary, very understanding of it. With second wife Jean, Doyle had what amounted to a second family. There were three children: Dennis, who was a big game hunter and an auto enthusiast who died sadly of a heart attack while on a hunting trip in India. Adrian was also a race car driver like his brother, a big game hunter, explorer, and writer. He was also his father's literary executor after his mother Jean died in 1940. On his death in 1970, his sister Jean took over as their father's literary executor. And Jean, whose nickname was Billy, by the way, she lived until 1997. She was a commandant in the Royal Air Force. She became Lady Bromett after her marriage to the Lieutenant Governor of the Isle of Man. And in 1963, became Dame Jean Conan Doyle when she was elevated at the Queen's birthday honors. Now, today, 8 family members, primarily great nieces and nephews, run the estate. And you can explore them and so much more at the ConanDoyleEstate.com. And we don't have time for this today, but to do an extensive visit, but it's really worthwhile. I put the link on my website, but just to give you a tease, You should be seeing now the official Conan Doyle website, and you can find out about the family who runs the business now, as it were, the business. Um, but it also has one of its possibilities that you can click on, which is really great, is the man. And if you click on that, um, the many men of Arthur Conan Doyle, and it really looks at all kinds of aspects of Doyle, his many facets. He was very much a Renaissance man. He was the adventurer, and then we have the author, and then we have the campaigner, and then we have the knight, and so forth. So it's really a cool website, and I hope that you can visit it, and I have the link on my website. Now, as it turns out, as a result of the emotional impacts of all the family deaths throughout the years, both Doyle and his children became avid spiritualists. Indeed, Conan Doyle viewed his most important efforts to be his campaign in support of spiritualism, which is the religion and psychic research built upon the belief that the spirits of the departed continue to exist in the hereafter and can be contacted by those still living. He donated the majority of his literary royalties and profits later in his life to this campaign. And books include The New Revelation, The Vital Message, Wanderings of a Spiritualist, The Case for Spirit Photography, and a two-volume The History of Spiritualism. And as you can see, with the exception of the New Revelation and the Vital Message, all of these really important works were written in the last decade of his life, in the 1920s. Now, Conan Doyle became the world's most renowned proponent of spiritualism, but he faced considerable opposition for his conviction from, among others, the world-renowned magician Harry Houdini, with whom he had a very interesting friendship. They were friends, but they were very diametrically opposed to each other on this topic of spiritualism. By the way, even spiritualists joined in criticizing Conan Doyle's The Coming of Fairies from 1922, in which he voiced support for the claim that two young girls, Elsie Wright and Frances Griffiths, had photographed actual fairies that they had seen in the Yorkshire village of Cottingley. Now, you could see one of those rather obviously doctored photographs on your screen. Yet somehow Doyle believed, or perhaps better put, wanted to believe, that this was all the real deal. Conan Doyle passed away on July the 7th of 1930. And a few days later, on July the 13th, thousands of people filled London's Royal Albert Hall for a seance, during which Estelle Roberts, a renowned spiritualist medium, claimed to have contacted Sir Arthur. Now, you can see Ms. Roberts on the stage, and you'll also notice that Sir Arthur's seance funeral packed the massive auditorium, which seats over 5,000 people. You can see this is standing room only. Once again, for more detailed information about Doyle's biography, you can check that out on my website, makingwings.net, and choose Deeper Dive number 4. But before we move on to discuss Doyle's publications, there are a few things that I came across while preparing this program that I'd love to toss into the mix. So let's have a brief look at 7 other, I call them quick facts. Number 1, in light of all the controversies we hear in the news today, I find this one fascinating. Doyle, probably because he was a doctor, was a staunch supporter of compulsory vaccination and wrote several articles advocating the practice and denouncing the views of what I guess we would today would call anti-vaxxers. Number two, we spoke a little about this before, but it's worth emphasizing. Once he was established as a writer, Doyle never fully pursued his medical career, though he always was willing to practice, including, as I told you, that 6 months as a medic surgeon in South Africa during the Boer War. Now, this tug and pull with medicine is handled quite nicely in Martin Booth's book, his biography, The Doctor and the Detective. It's really a very good read. And again, I have this listed on my website if you want to copy down a title and the author's name. Well, on to number three. Doyle was an avid sportsman. He was a world-class cricket player, a very competent amateur boxer, a more than adequate golfer, and an excellent billiards player. I guess what I'm trying to paint here is a very well-rounded man with keen interests and abundant curiosity. In other words, and maybe this comes again from being a doctor, a scientist, every aspect of life was to be explored as far as Doyle was concerned. Now, for a man who was a physician, he was also, unsurprisingly, a humanitarian, right? Number four should not come as a surprise to us. Doyle was a fervent advocate of justice and personally investigated two closed cases that ultimately led to two men, George Idalgi in 1907 and Oscar Slater in 1908, being exonerated of the crimes of which they were accused, respectively, animal abuse and murder. In both cases, insufficient and circumstantial evidence, as well as inconsistent testimony, had led to a miscarriage of justice. In fact, Doyle's work on the Idalgi case, you see him there in the upper right of your screen, work on that case on Doyle's part helped to establish a way to correct other miscarriages of justice. And it resulted in the establishment of the Court of Criminal Appeals in Great Britain in 1907. And to this day, if you look into the archives of the Court of Criminal Appeals, they will basically say that it's Arthur Conan Doyle that we can thank for having this Court of Criminal Appeal in Britain. Now, number five on our list, this is a kind of a strange one, but it's fun. I wanted to share this one with you. Some scholars early on suggested that Doyle may have been the perpetrator or one of the perpetrators of the Piltdown Man hoax of 1912, which was later proven to be a counterfeit ancient hominin fossil that fooled the scientific world for over 40 years. And the theory of Doyle's involvement has long since been debunked. So now, for those of you who are not familiar with Piltdown Man, here it is. The Piltdown Man was a paleoanthropological fraud in which bone fragments were presented, this is in 1912, they were presented as the fossilized remains of a previously unknown early human. It was promoted as the so-called missing link between apes and humans. Well, the fragments were ultimately found to be the altered mandible and some teeth of an orangutan, deliberately combined with the cranium of a fully developed, though small-brained, modern human. Now, although there were doubts about its authenticity virtually from the beginning, the remains were still broadly accepted for many years, and the falsity of the hoax was only definitively demonstrated in 1953. An extensive scientific review in 2016 established that amateur archaeologist Charles Dawson was responsible for the fraudulent evidence, And any connection to Arthur Conan Doyle, who was publicly fascinated by this story, well, that was absolutely proven false. Uh, I wanted to share this little story about Piltdown Man and the hoax. It's really prominent for two reasons. The first, of course, is all the extraordinary attention the hoax generated around the subject of human evolution. And the second is the sheer length of time. 41 years elapsed from its alleged initial discovery to the definitive exposure as a complete forgery. Well, flash forward to where we are now in the world, and we know how easy it is to basically tell lies in the guise of truth. And people believe it, right? So hoaxes may even be a little easier today thanks to social media, but this was one of the first really great examples. It starts in 1912. Now, for number 6, we go back to that son Kingsley from his first marriage. For many years, people wondered whether the death of Kingsley from pneumonia as a result of the worldwide flu pandemic in 1918 was the impetus for Doyle's obsession with spiritualism. But the reality is that Doyle's interest was well established long before and well after the death of his beloved son in 1918. The death of his first wife, his younger brother Innes, and other close friends and relatives were all part of an increasing belief that one could communicate with those who had passed away, especially through seances. Yes, Kingsley's death was a major blow to Doyle, but it wasn't the only reason for his spiritual beliefs. And finally, number 7, none of Doyle's 5 children from the 2 marriages produce grandchildren. So there are no living direct descendants, only peripheral relations. On your screen, you see a photo of Doyle and his second wife, Jean, with their 3 children. Dennis on your left, Billy in the middle, also known as Jean, and Adrian on the right. So there you have a potpourri of additional biographical material about Doyle. And once again, there's much more available on my website if you take that deeper dive number 4. But now what I'd like to do for the rest of our program is to take a look at Doyle's literary output, all the while remembering that through all of his career as a writer, there was also this vocation as a doctor. And we begin with the picture on your screen. If I say the name Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, most people will immediately respond with the name Sherlock Holmes. Oh, but there's so much more. And that's what I'm hoping to tease you with this evening. Doyle produced 22 novels in his life. 22. Only 4 of which are about Holmes. Another 3 of those books are about the equally intriguing character, Professor George Edward Challenger. The rest are all standalone works that Doyle was very proud of. And then there are 204 short stories, of which only 56 are about Holmes. The remaining 75% of his narratives were about a variety of topics and characters, including 16 about an absolutely hilarious fellow named Brigadier Gerard. There are 16 story collections, only a third of which are about Holmes. And to top it off, we have 4 books of war poems, 14 plays, 13 spiritualist books, 10 spiritualist pamphlets, and even 1 operetta written in 1893 called Jane, Annie, or the Good Conduct Prize, co-written with the creator of Peter Pan, none other than J.M. Barrie, with music by Ernest Ford, a student of Sir Arthur Sullivan of Gilbert and Sullivan fame. The opera wasn't particularly successful in London, but it did very well with a national touring company for many years. Now, much of Doyle's first work first appeared in the Strand magazine. The Strand was a monthly British magazine that published primarily short fiction, serializations of novels, and general interest articles. It was printed in the United Kingdom from January of 1891 to March of 1950, running to 711 issues. Its immediate popularity is evidenced by an initial sale of its first edition of nearly 300,000 copies. Sales continued to increase in the early months before settling down to a circulation of more than 500,000 copies a month, which lasted well past the 1930s. And until his death, Doyle's death in 1930, Doyle was one of the magazine's stars. Between 1891 and the year of his death, 1930, Doyle published 121 short stories in the Strand, along with 70 articles, 9 serialized novels, 2 interviews, and 1 poem. With Brigadier Gerard, Sherlock Holmes, and Professor Challenger's stories becoming the real favorites with readers. Now, there were other series in the Strand that also became popular, besides the Holmes and Gerard and Challenger series. Once a month in 1898, for example, Doyle produced 12 tales of suspense and adventure, of the mysterious and the fantastic. Murder, madness, ghosts, unsolved crimes, diabolical traps, and inexplicable disappearances abound in these 12 narratives. In 1908, Doyle added an additional 5 stories and published a collection called Round the Fire Stories. But it was in Strand that most of these goosebump stories saw their first light. Now, surprisingly, this collection is out of print, but you can find used copies online. My edition, which you actually see there on the right of your screen, my edition is a discontinued library book from Wilmington, North Carolina, that I was able to purchase through Amazon. So you can get these book, but you're going to have to do some digging. But yes, the Round of the Fire stories, they're really lots of fun. The 3 Strange Studies from Life from 1901 are all that Doyle completed of 12 such pieces intended for the Strand magazine, one for each month of the year. But in the 3 narratives that we do have, he addresses issues of criminal motivation, public reaction to violent crime, and their effects on trial judges' objectivity. Again, seems rather a contemporary topic, doesn't it? Once again, the best place to find them are online in collections like the one that you see on the right of your screen. Again, one that I picked up at a local bookstore here in Portland, Oregon, the Powell's Books. Yeah, I actually got it on their online store. I think it's really a shame that we have to dig around to find these stories. They're really just as well written and as engaging as any of the Sherlock Holmes stories. They just don't have Sherlock Holmes in them, but they're really great mysteries and just very engaging. Now, if you'd really like to sample something other than Sherlock Holmes, I recommend Brigadier Gerard. He's the comedic hero in a series of 17 history-based short stories, 2 short story collections, and a play. Brigadier Etienne Gerard is an officer in the French army during the Napoleonic Wars at the beginning of the 19th century. Gerard's most notable attribute is his vanity. He is utterly convinced that he's the bravest soldier, the greatest swordsman, the most accomplished horseman, and the most gallant lover in all of France. I said the beginning of the 19th, it's also the late 18th as well. Gerard is not entirely wrong, since he does display notable bravery on many occasions, but his self-satisfaction undercuts his attributes quite often. Obsessed with honor and glory, he's always ready with a stirring speech or a gallant remark to a lady. Now, Doyle, in making his hero a vain and often rather uncomprehending Frenchman, was able to satirize both the stereotypical English view of the French and, by presenting them from Gerard's baffled point of view, English manners and attitudes. So he's kind of making fun of both sides of the channel there. It's delicious satire, especially if you have some background in English or French history. But even if you don't, the stories are quite droll and it may surprise you. They're quite different from his mystery or detective fiction. Now, another aspect of Doyle that most readers aren't aware of is his poetry. He published 4 collections in his lifetime: Songs of Action in 1898, Songs of the Road in 1911, The Guards Came Through in 1919, which was his contribution to the onslaught of British war poetry after World War I. Everybody and his uncle that was a writer was writing war poetry during and after the First World War. Well, this is his contribution. And in 1922, the collected poems. Now, stylistically, many of his poems are ballads, which means they're poems that tell a story. And some of his principal narrators are common soldiers, hardworking laborers, and the denizens of rural communities. Now, like some of his stories, several poems are intended to create a sense of mystery, such as this poem called A Tragedy. Who's that walking on the moorland? Who's that moving on the hill? They are passing mid the bracken, but the shadows grow and blacken, and I cannot see them clearly on the hill. Who's that calling on the moorland? Who's that crying on the hill? Was it bird, or was it human? Was it child or man or woman? Who was calling so sadly on the hill? Who's that running on the moorland? Who's that flying on the hill? He is there, and there again, but you cannot see him plainly, for the shadow lies so darkly on the hill. What's that lying in the heather? What's that lurking on the hill? My horse will go no nearer, and I cannot see it clear. Oh, but there's something that is lying on the hill. It's an intriguing poem because it never quite explains the title, does it? A tragedy. Some tragic event has happened here, perhaps, and this particular moorland has shadows and the strange voices to prove it. But what was it? A war, a famine, disease? All of that is left to our imagination. And just as Doyle was capable of creating humor in his Brigadier Gerard stories, so he was able to do the same in witty poems like A Parable. The cheese mites asked how the cheese got there and warmly debated the matter. The orthodox said it came from the air, and the heretics said from the platter. They argued it long and they argued it strong, and I hear they are arguing now. But of all the choice spirits who lived in the cheese, not one of them thought of a cow. I love that one. Of course, a parable is a story intended to teach a lesson, often using metaphorical people, places, or things to represent real life situations or people. So in this humorous poem, the narrator presents us with the quasi-intelligent cheese mites debating the origin of their cheese all the while completely overlooking the most obvious choice. It's a cow. Doyle invites us to think about some of the people we know who might be like those mites: intellectuals, politicians, scientists. Well, there are probably many candidates. Oh, and then there are the 13 spiritualist books, such as The Case for Spirit Photography in 1922, The Coming of the Fairies, also in 1922, and the last work published in his lifetime, The Edge of the Unknown. The book was published on the 20th of June in 1930, and Doyle passed on 3 weeks later on July the 7th. Now, that last book is a collection of essays and articles written primarily in the 1920s about the afterlife, psychic powers, and ghosts. The first essay is about Harry Houdini, with whom he shared a very, we'll call it tenuous friendship. Houdini saw spiritualists and mediums as frauds, while Doyle saw magic like Houdini's, fairies, and other supernatural creatures as reality. So he's very complimentary to Houdini. Doyle spent much time and financial resources promoting spiritualism, including the opening of the Psychic Bookshop in London in 1925. So I'm going to have a little fun with you right now. What I have for you is a 77-second home movie. It's silent. It's a silent home movie dating from 1925 that shows his daughter Mary and some employees in front of the store with a cameo by Sir Arthur himself. So this is just 5 years before his passing, but this was at the height of his interest in the psychic. So let me bring this on screen. And again, I want to make sure that we are sharing it. There is no sound with this, but enjoy home movies. Okay, so Doyle's daughter Mary from his first marriage is there on the left with some workers. Then we skip a little bit and yeah, here we go. There you see Doyle on the left with two workers from the store. Looking ever so dapper there, Mr. Doyle. And then our little home movie shows him with his daughter Mary from the first marriage. And she basically operated this psychic bookstore. Now, an interesting thing that happens in this little video is you get a view from inside of a carriage near the store. And as you can see, in 1925, it was still a combination of cars and horses. And here are more views of workers outside of the store. And they're having a grand old time. Now, lots of fun, right? There we go. So little home movie courtesy of the Doyles there. Now, as the two photos that you see now on your screen show, this was not some tiny storefront. This was a major bookshop supported financially by one of England's great writers who firmly believed in the realities of the paranormal. Well, now let's move on to more traditional territory. I really recommend the three Professor Challenger novels, especially the first one, The Lost World, which was published in 1912. And that's where dinosaurs come in. That's why it's lost. And it's a world that has these prehistoric creatures in them. Well, it's interesting. Published 1912, meaning that it predates Edgar Rice Burroughs' very similar novel, The Land That Time Forgot, by 6 years. Now, of course, Jules Verne had explored the theme of a lost world in Journey to the Center of the Earth in 1864 and The Mysterious Island in 1874. But what sets apart Doyle's book, as well as the subsequent novels in the Challenger series, The Poison Belt in 1913 and The Land of the Mist, it's over there on the very far right, 1926, is that character of George Edward Challenger, a tall, gruff, bearded scientist inventor whose larger than life personality is the complete opposite of the wraith like contemplative Sherlock Holmes. Now, in the lower left of your screen, you see the noted actor Wallace Beery as Professor Challenger in the first film version of The Lost World from 1925. This 110-minute long film, and it was quite long for a film in those days, was the first to use a technique called stop motion to create the dinosaurs of the ancient past. Here's Chief Animator Willis O'Brien placing one of the models on the miniature set. And here's a scene involving the stop motion dinosaurs. And here's some fun trivia. In April of 1925, on a Paris to London flight by Imperial Airways, a forerunner of British Airways, a portion of The Lost World was shown, making it the first in-flight film to be shown to airline passengers. Isn't that delicious trivia there? And you can see on the side of the plane, you can see First International, The Lost World around the world's Imperial Airlines and so forth. It's the first in-flight movie. Love it. Now, the film has been beautifully restored and is available in DVD and Blu-ray formats, as well as streaming on YouTube. Now, of course, by our modern standards, this is a 100-year-old film. We kind of chuckle at it, but if you can kind of put aside your modern sensibilities and just watch it, it is just lots of fun and actually quite faithful to the novel. Towards the end of his life, by the way, Doyle claimed that of all his characters, it was the adventurous Professor Challenger and not Sherlock Holmes who was his favorite. It's another interesting piece. And we have his letters and writings in which he says that. Yeah, he liked Sherlock Holmes, but he liked Challenger better. Well, yet, of course, for millions of readers, there may be some disagreement, because around the world it was and is Sherlock Holmes rather than Brigadier Gerard or George Challenger who remains the favorite. The individual stories, and as I said, there are 56 of them, were put into 5 collections. The Adventure of Sherlock Holmes in 1892, The Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes in 1894, The Return of Sherlock Holmes in 1905, The Last Bow in 1917, and last but not least, The Casebook of Sherlock Holmes, published in 1927. Now, each of these volumes is full of gems. Some of my personal favorites include the Christmas holiday story, The Adventure of the Blue Carbuncle, in the first volume, The Final Problem, in which Holmes supposedly dies in the memoirs, The Adventure of the Empty House, in which Holmes is found to be alive, and the very clever Adventure of the Solitary Cyclist, both of which are in The Return, and a crime of passion story called The Adventure of the Cardboard Box in his Last Bow, and finally, a tale of fraternal jealousy run amok in The Adventure of the Sussex Vampire in the Casebook of Sherlock Holmes. So if you have a spare hour, any or all of these tales are wonderful, clever diversion, especially on a rainy afternoon or a cold, blustery winter's evening. And we're getting close to those kinds of evenings soon. So these are great stories. Now, as far as the infamous story, The Final Problem, is concerned, in an article published by the BBC, Jennifer Armstrong noted that the public reaction to the death of Holmes was unlike anything previously seen for fictional events. There were some reports that young men throughout London wore black mourning crepes on their hats or around their arms for the month of Holmes's death, although these may have been exaggerations propounded by Doyle's son Kingsley. Armstrong continues that readers typically accepted what happened in their favorite books and then they moved on. But now they were beginning to take their popular culture personally and to expect their favorite works to conform to certain expectations. In other words, Sherlock Holmes was being treated as if he were a living, breathing person, not just the creation of an author's imagination. Pressure from fans eventually persuaded Doyle to bring Holmes back, writing The Hound of the Baskervilles, which is actually chronologically set before this story, The Final Problem, and then miraculously reviving him in The Adventure of the Empty House, included in The Return of Sherlock Holmes. Now, part of the bring back Holmes craze was ameliorated when the noted American actor William Gillette brought the detective to life in a stage play simply called Sherlock Holmes in 1899. 2 years before the August 1901 appearance of the flashback novel The Hound of the Baskervilles in the Strand, and his official resurrection in The Adventure of the Empty House in October of 1903. So Gillette's play dates from 1899, before Doyle actually brought him back in story form. Now, the background to this play is really interesting. So, recognizing the success of his character Sherlock Holmes and the blowback from the character's death, published in December of 1893, rather than writing more stories, Doyle decided to pen a play about him. Now, after discussions with the American producer Charles Frohman in 1899, Doyle was inspired to pen a 5-act play featuring Holmes and his nemesis, Professor Moriarty. But upon reading the play, Frohman felt that as it was written, it really didn't work well on the stage. It would be much better as a novel or a story. It just didn't work as a play. So instead, Frohman suggested that the actor and successful playwright William Gillette would be an ideal Sherlock Holmes. He would also be the perfect person to rewrite the play because Gillette was also a very accomplished playwright. So, to help persuade Doyle, William Gillette donned a deerstalker cap and a caped coat to visit Doyle and requested permission to do a rewrite of Doyle's play and permission to perform the lead role. Well, Doyle must have been very impressed by all the effort because he agreed. And after 3 previews, the play Sherlock Holmes premiered on Broadway on November the 6th of 1899 at the Garrick Theater in New York City. It was an immediate success and became a signature piece for Gillette, who revised the play several times over the years and performed the title role over 1,300 times through the late 1920s. Now, on your screen, you see several photos of Gillette and cast members from that original 1899 Broadway run, including the intriguing one that is in the lower right that shows Sherlock Holmes with his syringe about to inject his famous 7% solution of cocaine. Now, of course, in addition to the 56 stories, there are the 4 novels. The first appearance of Sherlock in A Study in Scarlet is from 1887. Then comes The Sign of the Four in 1890. I'm going to talk about that title in a moment. The Hound of the Baskervilles in 1902, which many consider Doyle's finest work, and The Valley of Fear from 1915. Now, in the 28 years between the first and the last novel, Holmes grew more and more emotionally complex, along with his relationship with Dr. Watson. So if you enjoy the stories, I think you'll really appreciate the detailed and nuanced novels. Let's take a brief look at each of these. Um, A Scarlet Letter is the first Holmes novel written by Doyle. It was first published in the Beaton's Christmas Annual in 1887. Doyle wrote the novel in about 6 weeks between March and April of 1886. And when writing it, the working title was The Tangled Skein, The Tangled Net. And he named the detective Shernford Holmes and the biographer Ormond Sacker. Well, just before publication, he changed the names, aren't we happy, to Sherlock Holmes and John H. Watson. Now, the second part of the novel is in two parts. The second part of the novel was eventually adapted for stage as Angels of Darkness, a play in 3 acts. And Doyle did this himself in 1888. Now, Doyle was commissioned to write the novel The Sign of the Four over a dinner with Joseph Stoddard, managing editor of the American publication Lippincott's Monthly Magazine, in August of 1889. Stoddard wanted to produce an English version of Lippincott's with a British editor and British contributors. So at this dinner, who was in attendance? Well, none other than Oscar Wilde, who eventually contributed the picture of Dorian Gray to the July 1890 issue. Now, I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall at that party. Now, the novel, Doyle's novel, first appeared in the February 1890 edition of Lippincott's as The Sign of the Four, appearing in both London and Philadelphia. The British edition of the magazine originally sold for a shilling and the American for 25 cents. Interestingly enough, surviving copies are now worth many, many thousands of dollars. Now, the novel was published in book form in October of 1890 by Spencer Blackett, using the foreword title, The Sign of Four. Now, the actual text in the novel nearly always uses the sign of the four, the 5-word form, to describe the symbol in the story, although the 4-word form is used twice by Jonathan Small in his narrative at the end of the novel. Well, as was the case with A Study in Scarlet, the Sign of the Four was not particularly successful to start with. I mean, it was successful, but it was meh. Okay, it was the short stories published from 1891 after these two novels were originally written. Doyle decides, I'm going to go to short story versions. Maybe they'll be more successful. Well, he was right. The short stories appearing from 1891 onwards in the Strand magazine, well, they made household names of Sherlock Holmes and his creator. In other words, it's the success of the stories that kind of backdoored the success of the original two novels. Now, The Hound of the Baskervilles was originally serialized in the Strand magazine from 1901 to April of 1902, August of 1901 to April of 1902. It tells the story of an attempted murder inspired by the legend of a fearsome, diabolical hound of supernatural origin. This was the first appearance of Holmes since his apparent death in The Final Problem. The success of The Hound of the Baskervilles led to the character's eventual revival. Now, on your screen, you see the wonderful Basil Rathbone as Holmes and Nigel Bruce as Watson. They played their roles 14 times between 1939 and 1946. The Hound, the movie version of The Hound, dates from 1939. And it's good old Basil Rathbone who, in that movie, utters the famous phrase, elementary, my dear Watson, which is a phrase that never appears in any of the 56 stories or 4 novels. It's pure invention. And it was also Rathbone who used the smaller pipe for practical reasons. It hid less of his face on screen. Now, of course, the pipe is another part of Holmes' mythology. Almost all interpretations of Sherlock Holmes include his tobacco use, and yet his most iconic prop, the enormous pipe, the calabash gourd with meerschaum bowl, also never appeared in any of Doyle's original writings, but it appears in so many pictures of Sherlock Holmes and in many other movie versions. Now, before we leave this slide, okay, I have to show you this. What I've just put up on the right of your screen is an actual page from the manuscript of the Hound of the Baskervilles. It's the original manuscript. Now, look at that. I absolutely chuckle every time I see that meticulously written manuscript. Arthur Conan Doyle may have been one of the few doctors on the planet who actually had neat handwriting. Now, the final Holmes novel is The Valley of Fear. It's loosely based on the Molly Maguires, an Irish 19th century secret society active in Ireland, Liverpool, and parts of the eastern United States, best known for their activism among Irish American and Irish migrant coal miners in Pennsylvania. It is also based on the real life Pinkerton agent, James McParland, an American private detective and labor spy noted for his success against the Molly Maguires. The novel was first published in the Strand magazine between September of 1914 and May of 1915. All right, so there you have it. It's an intriguing, he's an intriguing, multifaceted person, a real Renaissance man, a very much a polymath. But again, once more, just please go to makingwings.net, my website, and choose Deeper Dive number 4. And while it was obvious that I had to discuss Doyle's Sherlock Holmes, I wanted to introduce you to the other aspects of this man's creative output. Indeed, most of that output had nothing to do with the great detective. And I think we cheat ourselves if we only taste the one flavor. So I hope you see today's presentation as an invitation to explore, as I've put up there on the bottom of your screen, the other Conan Doyle, the spiritualist, the humanitarian, the poet, and the creator of the amusing Brigadier Gerard and the vociferous Professor Challenger. So, seems to me like this is a great place to discuss your thoughts and ideas, and perhaps someone can help me read through some of the questions if there are any.
I would be happy to. Thank you so much. That was
Thanks,
very
Angie.
informative. Let's see, we did have a few comments throughout the presentation about our subject matter. Let's see, it says some comments, some questions. Comment, yes, I remember being so surprised finding out just how dedicated Arthur Conan Doyle was to the paranormal beliefs as a Sherlock Holmes fan. So this attendee was just surprised to find that out. I think it wasn't new to her tonight, but it might have been new to some of our attendees. So was that your same experience?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, when I'm dating myself here, but when I was in college in the back in the day, if you read Conan Doyle, and you did, it would usually be those wonderful mystery stories. It would be the Sherlock Holmes. And it was only later on, and I want to say it was in grad school, that one of my professors, kind of said, guess what? This man was also into spiritualism. He was also a doctor. He was all these other things. So it was only after the fact that I realized that, yes, indeed, Arthur Conan Doyle, he's more than Sherlock Holmes.
Um, let's see, we said, commented on even bringing Sherlock back to life. And, do you think, I was wondering, do you think that the fact that he killed off Sherlock and then, oh, it was such an outcry, do you think that's why Sherlock is the most popular character?
It could, well, it, let's be here. Let's call the spade a spade here. Um, Doyle realized that his biggest cash cow was Sherlock Holmes. And I think there was just such pressure. And then with the enormous success of the play with by William Gillette, which was written 2 years before Hound of the Baskervilles and 6 years before he finally said, "Okay, I'm bringing this guy back to life." He just realized, he had to. Now, P.S. As a little bit of a sidebar, it shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone if you're familiar with Stephen King's novel Misery, made into a wonderful film with Kathy Bates, which is about a fan of a of a writer who basically forces him to bring a character back to life that he had killed off. And King, openly admits that the inspiration was basically what Doyle did, that he was literally in that position of having to be kind of forced his hand. And the publishers at Strand Magazine said, your other stories are doing well. We love them. We love Gerard. We love Challenger. We love all these things. But, how about a little more Sherlock? And of course, he went on to write many more Sherlock stories.
We have a question here that says, and you might have touched on this a little bit at least, did he write any fiction involving spiritualism? Anything that might be seen as a gothic type story?
Yeah, the very first novel that he wrote, the mystery of McClumber, of the Clumer, excuse me. The mystery of Clumber, Cloomber, 1889, and you can get that. Is probably his best of the novels that kind of deal with this, but the bulk of his writing about spiritualism was nonfiction. Those books that he writes between 1918 and close to his death. The one that was just published, The Edge of the World, in 1930. They all are nonfiction. They treat the subject very seriously. But I would recommend, if someone wants to read a book that does have that element in it, The Mystery of Clumber from 1889.
Very good. A comment from someone who lives not far from where you grew up in New York City. I'm in Connecticut, she says, home of the amazing Gillette Castle.
Yes.
There we go.
Yeah.
Heavily recommending, let's see, this attendee heavily recommend The Final Reckoning by David Stewart Davies if anyone is a fan of Sherlock Holmes plays.
Oh, interesting.
Have you
Okay.
read that title?
No, I have not read that title, so thank you for that recommendation. Of course, as we all know, I mean, Sherlock Holmes just, has been incarnated so many times. Most recently in a wonderful series on CBS called Elementary. And then, of course, the Benedict Cumberbatch BBC ones, which I think everybody just kind of fell in love, not only with him, but with this presentation, which updates it. And a lot of Holmes works, do that. And then, of course, there's that classic movie, The 7% Solution. There's just wonderful stuff. But I had not heard of that title, so add it to my list.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, you always want to see great characters live on, and I think anytime a adaptation can bring modern audiences and introduce them into, standard characters like Sherlock, I think it's great. So,
Yeah,
um,
absolutely. Especially when
what title
they're
would you?
really good performances. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. What title would you recommend if we wanted to dig a little deeper? What's your favorite Arthur Conan Doyle book?
Oh, ho, ho. Oh, come on. Sophie's Choice. Do I have to make my
Or just a title?
I would say that if you want to get a good introduction to Doyle, and this is kind of also favorite titles. I would go with Hound of the Baskervilles and The Lost World. Those are two excellently written novels, and they're very engaging. And I have always, they were really my introduction to, well, first what came, of course, uh, The Hound of the Baskervilles in college. But then someone said, "Hey, did you know that he writes this really cool book, The Lost World?" Oh, okay. And then, of course, what I found fascinating is, of course, the book was very, very popular, and of course, over here in America, Edgar Rice Burroughs kind of cashes in on that when he, writes his kind of version of that, "The Land Time Forgot," 6 years later. But those would be my two favorites, and I think those would be two that would be great starting points for people, and then you expand yourself out. And don't forget those fun poems.
Very good. Well, thank you all so much. We had, oh wait, one more. You sort of addressed this. This person says they missed the first few minutes. Was Doyle a ski buff? I think you had skiing on his list of sports that he
Yeah,
enjoyed.
he knew how to ski. Yes, and he was a billiard player. And I think one of the more interesting things, he was literally a world class medal receiving cricket player. I mean, the guy was, and he was a boxer.
He was
Which,
very real well rounded.
if you look at his picture, he reminds me of physically. It's kind of a Teddy Roosevelt,
Yeah,
and he's just kind of a husky guy, and you could see him boxing his way around there.
indeed. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. We had
Oh,
several comments that thanked you, Dr. Felder, and we hope that you all enjoy the program and watch it again.
thank you very much, Mid-Continent Library. It is a pleasure to always speak. I hope that we might be able to see each other again in the future.
Hopefully. So thank you
Okay.
all. Have a good
Okay.
night.
Take care, everyone. Have a beautiful evening. Take care.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye.